up a bit, there was a question. Mike said, who are the they that chose these texts? I can't tell you their names. I'm sure one of them was Fred, but just kidding. Back in Charlemagne's time, the research I did didn't list specific offices of the church of the people. I'm assuming they were fairly high-level educated folks who were brought together to kind of do some choosing of what was going to happen. I do know that in the mid-20th century, when the ecumenical councils started to gather together, there were representatives from many of the different denominations that were chosen to go and undergo the work of choosing the texts that would tell the biblical story. And so from all of the different representatives, this was not an easy process, which is why coming up with a 3-year lectionary as compared to just a 1-year standard set of readings took a variety of years. And you know, when you get in committee, take whatever time it would take to do something and multiply it by 10. But they had to come and look from all the different theological perspectives at what texts were going to be chosen and take the time to make sure that things didn't overlap or repeat too much. And so at least knowing that it was a representative council chosen from people from different denominations helps put a little bit of a sense of the they. There wasn't a monkey with the darts, as they describe, throwing things at the wall saying, this one will be good. Although, I have to say, sometimes you read some of these texts and you think, what were they thinking? How do these things go together? Well, I want to talk a little bit about what's actually involved in the Revised Common Lectionary. Just for an example, because one of the strengths and weaknesses of the lectionary is that we're talking about a specific number of texts. And so even as you go through the readings and it's following the story, there still is a limited amount of the Bible that can or will be read. Here's what's happening in the Old Testament. If you want to take a look, there are, how many books in the Old Testament? 39, thank you. And of those 39 books, you can take a look. There are 10 Old Testament books that have 0 assigned readings from them. 5 with 1, 8 with 2, and 5 with 3. So 76% of the Old Testament is completely or virtually ignored in our 3-year lectionary. Here's an example. The Book of Lamentations, which may or may not be your favorite book. My guess is, if asked, you could name 2 verses from the Book of Lamentations. Anybody want to know what they are? Which ones?
Great is thy faithfulness.
Great is thy faithfulness. God's mercies are ever renewed. They are new every morning. That verse from Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 and 23 is a great verse, very meaningful. It's also the only one from the entire book of Lamentations that's ever read. And so, probably it's the only one that you will ever know. Is there other stuff in that book? Sure. But one of the challenges is we won't necessarily know what it is because those 2 verses are read once every 3 years and then moved on without, as Rich said, without some of the context for what goes along with them.
Song of Solomon.
Song of Solomon. How many readings are in the Song of Solomon? None. In fact, if you go to the next slide, the 10 books that have no readings in them, the book of Judges, the book of Ruth, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Esther, Song of Solomon, Joel, Obadiah, Nahum, and Haggai are all books that nothing is read. So how do you get to know what's in these books? You have to do the work yourself. Not necessarily a bad thing, but one of the inherent problems is if you don't ever go beyond what's happening in worship, you're never going to know. You might learn the story of the book of Ruth in Sunday school. Maybe you'll hear it at a wedding occasionally, a couple of verses. You might know the story of the book of Esther if your grandchild watches VeggieTales. But other than that, these are books that are never included in worship, and they're things that we don't know. Right.
Interesting thing about Esther, there's no mention of God, there's no prayer. If you read that book and didn't know it was from the Bible, it would be just another interesting story.
Exactly.
But the Roman Catholic Church, in adopting the Apocrypha, has readings in Esther that our prayers and God is included.
Yep, and the whole concept in the book of Esther, who knows, for such a time as this, you may have been chosen, is a message that we've woven into our popular culture. You know, along with God must have happened for a reason. This is maybe the reason that we come to understand that God is done. So we have that message from Esther that sometimes comes in without ever understanding the bigger story of what's happening. And like you said, without even knowing that it's a biblical book at all. Let's take a look at what's in. Go on to the next one, Charlie. If you take a look at those books that are a part of the lectionary, the books, 66 books have 71% of those assigned readings. Those are the books of Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, 1 Kings, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. 108 out of the 153 readings come from these 6 books. Now granted, they are large books, they make up a very large percentage of the Old Testament, and they're huge when it comes to understanding God's story. So I'm not faulting the lectionary authors for choosing these 6 particular books. But it is interesting to note that of even these 6 books, 33% of them come from the book of Isaiah. And the majority of those come from 2nd Isaiah. Why?
A little more optimistic.
A little more optimistic, maybe. Yeah, there's some of that Isaiah depressing stuff that doesn't get in there either. Why do we read from 2nd Isaiah? Prophecy. The stories that have been chosen from Isaiah are those ones that we read at Christmas time and Advent. The stories that tell us about the coming of Christ. The stories that underscore that concept that Jesus is it. Again, prophecy is a wonderful thing, and as Christians, we believe that Christ is the fulfillment of what God was doing. But the subtle message that is sent is that does the Old Testament matter? Is it seen as being real scripture? That's not necessarily the sense you're going to get if all you ever read are sections from the Old Testament that show what happened in the New Testament. And this is probably why many of us have either a distorted view of God or a lack of understanding of how to read the Old Testament when we do venture beyond what happens in church. When you start reading some of those books that are neglected because there's lots of violence or because God doesn't seem very nice, He's smiting people and punishing them, we don't know how to put that in context. And so, as preachers, when we come to worship, if we're never given a chance to talk about those texts, and as congregations, if we're never given the chance to read those texts and learn about the context, it makes our Bible a little bit smaller, and it limits the view that we have of God. Let's take a look at the New Testament. The New Testament text is read every Sunday in the historical lectionary, so many of these texts are more familiar. To those of you who were raised with the old black book, the red book, 197 readings from Acts and the epistles. But even of those, there are 6 books, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, and Hebrews, that make up almost 2/3 of what those readings are. So even those stories that we read, the lessons, the letters from Paul, tend to be the ones that we are more familiar with. And a couple of books that aren't included at all, 2nd John, 3rd John, the book of Jude, there's nothing in them that's ever read as part of the context of the lectionary as well. As far as the New Testament goes, the Gospels, because they're read on a 3-year cycle, we don't ever read fully through any of those books either. And when the lectionary year follows the church year, some of the gospel texts are admitted for repetition's sake. If you're going to read a parable that's in the book of Matthew, you're not necessarily going to read the version from the book of Luke. But you also, what ends up happening is we flatten out the Bible. Because if you've done reading elsewhere, you kind of piece together something that was in this particular story, a detail from that story, and you start mushing them together. And a great example of this is the Christmas story. Do you read the Christmas story in any one particular book? Of course not. And Lori talked about that when he did a Forum back in December. Our common understanding of the Christmas story comes from bits and pieces that we kind of amalgamate together. Angels and Mary and the donkey and the shepherds and the angels and the wise men and Joseph being told that he should take Mary as his wife, and we kind of mush it all together and create a flat understanding of the story. And that's not, again, necessarily bad, but it does take out the different contexts of what scriptural authors are trying to get across. And it means that in our heads, our story of God may or may not match what we read in the biblical text. Another interesting thing to note is that when the Gospels were edited for inclusion, there were lots of texts that were omitted because they were necessarily violent, because of anti-Semitism, because they were texts of destruction, because they weren't theologically pretty. The texts that we read tend to follow a certain lens of what we come to understand about God. And some of the readings, when you read specific exhortations against the Jews, for example, were taken out of the lectionary because, for lack of a better term, it wasn't politically correct. And following what happened in World War II, think about that. 10 years later, when they started taking a look at expanding the lessons, the last thing that church officials, church leaders would have wanted to do was to try and incite more of what happened in World War II with the Holocaust and destruction. And so, for some of those reasons, when you read the Bible, again, you'll find texts that really can be quite shocking because we're not used to hearing Jesus saying things against the Jews in that particular tone of voice. Interestingly also, some churches have opted to disregard the common lectionary because it does leave out some of the more moralistic texts. For example, the reading of the woman caught in adultery is not included as part of the lectionary. Any condemnation of homosexuality, not included as part of the lectionary. Not a bad thing, but what we do is we end up missing an opportunity to talk about what the Bible says in the context of worship. And so our lenses start to be a little bit skewed from that perspective too. There is one thing to note, though, about having some lessons that are the same. And when you start following the course of a church year with a 3-year lectionary, every single year, Advent 2 and Advent 3, the second and third Sundays of Advent, we preach on who? John the Baptist. So as a preacher, you get a lot of John the Baptist. Second Sunday, third Sunday, all the time. The first Sunday of Lent is always the story of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. It fits in the context of the season, but you can go to church for how many years and not know this is what's coming. So the concept of we've created this master story so we can understand the big picture, they don't always clue us in to say, by the way, this is what's coming.